heroin.
Now, did you see any notes when I came into Kamoinge? Because I always thought it was 70. I thought it was right after film school, and then, but I knew it was very close to when Ming came in. But I think I was in before Ming came in too.
I have not yet seen minutes from the early 70s.
Okay.
I know that you and Ming were the two that came in at some point in the early 70s, and I know it's by the time we took the photos. He keeps saying those were 73, but those were actually 72.
Okay.
So, you guys were certainly members by 72, only documented by that, but you could have come in earlier from all I know.
I thought I did, because I thought I came in right after film school. Well, how did you find out about the show at the Black Arts?
Yeah, I can start there. Are we on? Yep, we're on. So, two different ways, and they're interesting. One was when Alphanar passed away. I was looking for his obituary. So it's very recent, and I think I just googled Alphanar in California, and I have googled his name for many other reasons. And for some reason, this time the thing that came up was in Google Books. It was a Negro Digest page from 1965, and it was announcing the inaugural show at Black Arts. I always get repertory mixed up. Black Arts Repertory School Theater, and it had all named all the photographers, including you, Alphanar, Lou Draper, and Jiggy Nance.
That's amazing.
And I got really excited, and there's a research assistant on the project, Shreya Cochran. And we had just learned from a professor I had in graduate school, who was doing a project on Black literary figures from the Harlem Renaissance through the 60s. He had just learned, he learned through that research over the years in the 1990s forward, he did Freedom of Information Act to the request through the FBI. So he did them for Baldwin, for Richard
Right.
A number of Langston Hughes, and he had one for Mary Baraka, and he had one for the Black Arts Repertory Theater. And so in those FBI papers was an ad in Muhammad Speaks for the same show. And so those are two things that.
It's so funny because I was the curator and I don't know any of that. I don't remember any of that.
Yeah.
So, and it's what's so funny to realize that people I would later work with, Alphanar and Lou and Sean were all there already. And I didn't realize I'd met them that early, which is really strange. It's kind of eerie, in fact, So
how did you, let's take a we can start there. How did you meet Amiri Baraka, and what was your relationship to the school when it started?
I met Amiri Baraka really early on. I had gone to Lincoln University. And then I transferred up from Lincoln University with a good friend, Willie Kozisitsil, a South African poet who became the poet laureate of South Africa. And he died actually last year in South Africa. But so we both decided we'd had enough of Lincoln University and we transferred to New York. He went to City College and I went to Columbia. And then, but I was always reading Amiri Baraka's work because he wrote about jazz and I was really interested in jazz. And so I would go to the 5 Spot because I was living around the corner from the 5 Spot too, and I saw him in there. So I started talking to him. And then, he said, well, I teach at Columbia and I teach at the new school. You can come by and sit in my classes. So I started going to the classes, and he invited me to come to a party. And the party was a Halloween party, which incidentally was my birthday. So they didn't know it was a Halloween party at the loft he lived in. And I later lived in the same building, on the floor beneath him, But it's a famous building because Archie Shepp lived there. The apartment I moved in was Archie Shepp's apartment. And Amiri lived on the top floor. And his ex-wife, Hetty Jones, she still lives there too. But a lot of musicians lived in the building. A lot of artists lived in the building. And so, that's my introduction to a lot of the artist scene from the Lower East Side. But he invited me to come to a concert they were doing at the Village Gate. And it was a concert for the Black Arts. It was a benefit concert for the Black Arts, and he had Coltrane, he had Albert Eiler, had Sun Ra, Archie Shepp. All of them were playing for that event. And after the party, after the event, he invited me to come to the Black Arts when he went there, when he moved up to it, when he opened the Black Arts. So I went up there and met half the artists from the Lower East Side, the Black artists from the Lower East Side, from the East Village, were also working with him. To Jover Street and William White and Dorothy White, and all of them were already there working with him. And so, but we became friends from that. We also became friends because we had an association with Newark. He was from Newark and I was from Newark also. So then it turns out I knew all the places he had been in Newark and the schools he went to in Newark too. But I was much influenced by him, by his writing about jazz, and just by the fact that his writing was political too. So when the Black Arts opened, I went there and worked with him at the Black Arts, and I helped open the Black Arts with him. And we worked there for basically the few months it was open. We had the summer program. I worked there doing that too. And I did their first photographic shows and some other shows too, so just curating for the Black Arts too. And it's so funny to find out later on that the first show we did, a lot of members of Kamoinge were in the show. And I didn't know them at the time, and I didn't realize I know them until now. I didn't realize that we had actually met much earlier on too. So there's some confusion in that too, where I met the other people that introduced me to other members of Kamoinge.
So who do you think you met first? Was it Jimmy Manis?
Probably Jimmy Manis, But I probably met them all because I hung the show and it was their work, So, but Jimmy is the first one I remember, and Jimmy and I became friends, and I'm not quite sure why. Then Jimmy called me one day and asked me, did I want to go to film school? So I said, yeah, I'm very much interested in that. So he hooked it up, so I applied to go to NYU's Graduate Institute of Film and Television. We went and I showed my portfolio to the head of the school at the time, Robert Sordek, and then he gave me a scholarship to come to the film school. And at the film school, the other student in that class, other black student in the class was Lou Draper. And I don't know if I knew Lou then, if I remembered knowing him then. All that's in the back now, in the mist somewhere of time. But we became very close friends. At least he was a very close friend of mine too. And I was very much influenced by him, but not necessarily his shooting style, because by the time I got there, I had studied photography with 4 different people, before. So I'd already studied photography formally for quite a while before I got there. But very much by Lou's dedication to artistry and his lack of compromise. I think some of that he got from Roy too, but Lou also had that, where you don't compromise artistically in what you do. Like the whole thing Roy had about shooting full frame, we all did that. We all shot full frame. I know that some of the members were jokingly saying that they cropped, but most of us would be insulted if you accused of us cropping. We shot full frame, we composed in the camera, and so we thought that was what we do. But by the time I got to film school, I had learned photography with my father. My father taught me when I was 14 years old. And we had a dark room in the basement, and so, that magic when you watch the image first come up and then you do that. And then my brother was studying photography at the Newark School of Fine and Industrial Arts. And at the time I was going to Arts High, an art school in Newark. And so I used to sit in on his photographic class. Then when I went to Columbia, when I left Lincoln, when I transferred to Columbia, I studied with Ralph Hattersley, he's a well-known photographer teacher, and he was a well-known theorist about photography. And because he liked my work and I think he liked me, he sent me to see a friend of his who was also teaching. She was teaching at the New School for Social Research. It was Lisette Modell. She was one of my teachers too. And after Lisette Modell, I went to grad school. I went to NYU. It was Paul Caponegro was the teacher. And along with Paul Caponegro was John Sarkowski and Peter Brunel. They were both at the time the curators of photography at the Modern. And they were the ones who actually, in terms of the United Statesian version of what art is, they were the ones who made it contemporary art. Because there's an older school of that, with Gertrude Casabear and Clarence White and all the older people from the photo sessionists who talked about photography as art. But the modern day, at least in the 60s and 70s, of declaring photography as a fine art was done by John Sarkowski, basically. So it was interesting to go through that whole process of looking at. And even with Paul Caponegro, I never necessarily liked the way he printed. I always thought he printed too dark too. But also I thought Roy printed too dark too. So, but that was my personal taste. But it wasn't. What was good was to know that they had a very specific definition of what their art was, and that they were true to that definition all the time too. That's one of the major things I learned from Lou and from Roy too, is that you have a voice. And I think that influence is coming out of also us all loving jazz too. Because in jazz, right now it's a little bit more processed. Everybody's going to the university to learn how to play jazz. But before that, you didn't. Before that, you woodshed or you played at the major educational institutions, as Albert Murray points out, with the big bands. So you would worked in a Duke Ellington band or a Count Basie band or a Fletcher Henderson band. You were getting a major university education. And that education is like, you're playing and you hit a wrong note, and then you have Lester Young and Ben Webster and turn their head and look away. You'll never do that again. You know, you will realize, wait a minute, I made a mistake. What did I do wrong? But it's a living experience to it, a living education. But I remember once I was asked by Deborah Willis, who's the dean of the photography school at NYU, to be in one of her panels. She does like maybe 5 or 6 panels a year of everything on the planet. And she wanted to talk about cultural institutions, and she wanted me to talk about Kamoinge. And so, you know, I interviewed a lot of the members of Kamoinge just to find out where our inspiration came from. And everybody, of course, had the same thing. We had Roy DeCarava, and we had even internal members, Lou Draper and Al Fanar and Adra Cowens as people who, and Buford Smith, who influenced the members within the group too. And then, but people outside the group, now Roy outside the group, Gordon Parks outside the group, but also, of course, Cartier-Bresson and Eugene Smith, and the kind of standard litany of top photographers, the top contemporary photographers. But then after that, everybody in the group talked about musicians. So, of course, the direct craft associated with other great photographers, but also the fact that the backbone of what we did was also based on music, based particularly on jazz, too. So, in fact, there's a newer member in the group who's actually, he's an older photographer, but he's a newer member of the group, Jules Allen. And he plays with that all the time. He plays with those ideas. He has a book called Rhythmology, where he's talking about visual rhythms, but the visual rhythms are parallel to musical rhythms too, and parallel to particularly the musical rhythms of jazz. And you could look at his work, and even if it doesn't have like angular motifs in it, you can still say it's Monkian, that it comes out of Thelonious Monk. But in terms of most of the members of the group, we were talking about Miles Davis, we were talking about John Coltrane, Duke Ellington, of course, and Louis Armstrong. But we were using the models outside of the photographic models. Our models were all jazz musicians. So, and also, part of it was the whole pursuit of excellence. And there is no one better in terms of being in an art world than a Duke Ellington or Louis Armstrong. There's no one better.
So many things you just said that I want to go back
Mm-hmm.
ask you more. It's great. It's wonderful.
No, and funny, when we look at artistic models for particularly Kamoinge members, there's always this great litany of photographers, of contemporary photographers who we all know from our art history. But then there's also all the musicians. And then you think about African-American life and African-American culture, there is no greater standard of excellence. You know, when Baraka used to joke about this all the time too, you know, when someone would ask him about, you know, who's the greatest writer he ever heard of, he said Duke Ellington. You know, but when we look at African-American art, and in fact, Albert Murray used to use that as a kind of pejorative. He used to say, well, you know, name the visual artist that's the equivalent of Duke Ellington. And that's unfair. That's unfair because there's no, I don't know what world you can find an artist that equivalent, you know. But the same with the models that we used in Kamoinge were Duke Ellington and Miles Davis in particular, and John Coltrane. So, like when you look at Roy DeCarava's work, Roy has a few hundred pictures of John Coltrane. Why? You know, I asked him one time about that. We did a show called The Sound I Saw, the jazz photographs of Roy DeCarava. And I asked him, I said, Roy, you have 8,000 pictures of Coltrane, and you got no pictures of Charlie Parker. What's up? How come you never photographed Parker? He said, I never thought he died. Think about it, because Parker died at 35. Why would you think he's going to drop dead? You know? Train lived on much longer, but he still died young. You know, he was in his 40s when he died. You know, but that whole presumption, no, Bird will be here for a while. But so you got all these photographs of John Coltrane and none of Charlie Parker. So, when he could have done both.
Just a second.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe names just called him unrestricted. He's outside. Sorry, one more. One more interaction.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Was you recording them, or you just
No, just talking to him, and all right, no, yeah. record them? That would be too responsible. Are you kidding? No, because I was just trying to get a sense of what was going on with the group. In fact, I should have brought the notes for that too. I can actually send it to you. So. Yeah. But it's really, really simple. It's not developed, not essay form.
I just asked about when you interviewed the members for the Double Willis talk, if that was recorded or took notes, because then you would probably listen.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to come back and talk quite a bit with you about a lot of things. It's interesting what you're saying about jazz too, because one of the things that I think is so important about Kamoinge, something Andrew's talked quite a bit about, is the role of education, because Lou had gone to university, Andrew had gone to university, and Virginia State had an art program when Lou was going there, but not specifically photography. And then, of course, Ohio University had just started its photography program when Andrew went. But
I hate to say this, but Andrew keeps talking about bullshit. When I was doing it, nobody considered it art. I said, Andrew, that's absolute bullshit. The school you went to was founded by Clarence White. He did it too by his son. His son is the director of the school. When you're there, they've already declared it in the 1800s that it's art. Now maybe you got the message late, but people knew it was art. It wasn't widely considered art, but it was. But there were circles where it was considered art. So.
But the role that the role of mentorship in Kamoinge, I think, was important because there weren't that many professional photography programs in general. There were just a few, and then two, that a number of the members like Jimmy Nannis and Sean Walker hadn't gone to university, and so Roy and Lou.
Well, I can talk about that too.
Yeah, that would be great to talk about.
Good.
The role of education.
Okay, but I think in terms of Kamoinge's development and Kamoinge's growth, like mentorship and education was an essential part of it, because basically it was also a self-help group. It was people working together, as it literally means in Kamoinge, but it was also what was needed was an education in the arts, an education in the craft of photography too, and only a few members actually had that. I think one of them was Adja, of the early members. I'm not quite sure about Al Fanar, because Al might have had it from the Navy, and I think Tony had some training in the Navy also too. But to look at it as art and to talk about the quality of prints and that was, only a few members really had that. So you had to work at it, and people were really severe about your craft too. So if you hadn't worked that out too, it's funny though, because Lou's printing. I know Lou is a great printer too, but Lou also printed for Eugene Smith. He also worked with Eugene Smith. He worked with people considered great craftspeople too, and and someone like Bresson doesn't even apply, because Bresson never printed his own work. So he had some craftsmen who printed his stuff too for him. So in terms of that kind of photographic sensibility, he wasn't part of that. That wasn't really what he was doing. But the other ones were. The other photographers were, that they looked at photography as having a tradition, and I think Adja was one of the people who had that understanding too. And I'm not quite sure where Al Fanar got it from, because Al is very much influenced by Japanese photography and Japanese art. But he's also a craft nut. There was incredibly beautiful prints too. And there was a whole thing about the beauty of a silver halide print. Those prints glow, and they have a quality that you can only produce if you're going for it. If you're trying to get that kind of glowing look. And it's impossible right now, because prints don't have silver in them anymore. So, you can't get that kind of glow. But part of the mentorship of Kamoinge was about teaching photography too. And it's not teaching like you don't know photography, but it's teaching what a fine print really is, what a great print is. And Lou was a great craftsman. We used to work in the darkroom together at NYU, so I know about that too. But we were both craft nuts also, because I had a job. I used to be a medical photographer too, and I worked with this guy Marshall Taub. It was at the New Jersey College of Medicine and Dentistry, and this was right before I left that job to go to film school. That's when I was hanging out with Lou. But the guy let us practice. He let us buy any film we wanted and let us buy any paper we wanted and let us practice in the darkroom all day long. So all we ever did was work in the craft. It was boring stuff we had to print. Ultimately, we're doing gross specimens in like a heart or a part of a kidney, and a lot of slides of graphs, But we were allowed to play with the technique and play with and he was a craft nut too. Marshall was a craft nut too. So he made sure that we understood what a good print was. And that was, I think, one of the benefits of Kamoinge. I think we might be a little lax in that right now because I've seen some prints up on the wall from shows we've done that shouldn't be up on the wall because they aren't those beautiful glowing prints too. In fact, a lot of the new members are craft nuts. Jules Allen and not actually a new member, but John Pinderhughes, he was a Canon master of the print. So he worked for Canon, showing people how to make beautiful prints. So and there's also Radcliffe Roy, who's another young member, who's an incredible artist too, an incredible printmaker too. There are a lot of crafted people in the group again too. But you'd have to be if you're going to constantly be analyzed for lapses in your craft. So you have to work at that too.
So maybe this would be a good time to talk. When we talked on the phone, you talked a little bit about what?
Wardrobe malfunction.
Oh,
This?
Yeah. This kitchen is.
Oh. It's a wardrobe malfunction. You think anybody will notice?
I haven't been in the frame.
Yeah.
Good. Just see my red underwear, that's all.
I hadn't even noticed. I'm all focused on the history. Okay, so yeah, maybe talking a little bit about Lou's role as teacher. We talked a little bit on the phone, and you were putting it in the positive. One of the things that I want to write about, and we've talked a little bit about the project. It just seems from the archive and then from talking to people that Lou is so much the philosophical kind of.
I think it was even more so than Roy. I think Lou was very much influenced by Roy, but Lou was more influential than Roy, because Roy was a kind of iconoclast, and Roy is a difficult personality. Lou was not a difficult personality, But I think part of the aspect when we talk about the development of craft in Kamoinge comes from Lou Draper, and it comes from Ray Francis. Because Lou and Ray taught photography all the time too. They taught at Pratt, they taught at different summer institutes. So we had a program at NYU for one summer where Lou also taught, but they were constantly teaching photography in schools, And then it's funny because I teach at Columbia, and one of the professors in the department I'm in the Institute for Research in African American Studies. Before I have to also say I'm also at NYU in Gallatin School of Individualized Study. But at Columbia, one of the professors, Stephen Gregory, who's an anthropologist, we were just talking about it, and he said, "Oh yeah, I'm a photographer too." I said, "Oh yeah, really?" And we started talking about photography, and I said, "Well, also I'm in a group that meets at Columbia all the time too. It's called Kamoinge." He said, "Really?" He said, "I was taught by the founder of Kamoinge. I was taught by Lou Draper. Did you know Lou?" I said, "Are you serious? One of my best friends." Of course I knew Lou. But it was really funny just to realize that they constantly had influence. But I think he studied with him at Pratt, when Lou and Ray taught at Pratt too. And they were nuts about craft. And we actually used to have a studio together with Lou, Ray Francis, myself, and Darryl Sivad, who's also a member in and out of Kamoinge, who's a comedian too. He's a comedian and an actor who had his own television shows for a while, but he's also a brilliant photographer too. We had a studio on 6th Avenue at 38th Street. 6th Avenue at 38th Street. What was so funny about it is I just remember Ray talking about feathering the light. How you get a light to go from a light bright to like turning into a shadow and but a smooth way of doing it, but it's called feathering. And it's just constantly talking about craft, constantly talking about different ways to process film so you get a different effect from the film too. So there was a heavy orientation of craft, and people were really severe with each other at the beginning. If you couldn't really print, they didn't presume that you would never be able to print, but they presumed that you had to do better than you showed. If you showed something bad, you were taking over the coals for that too. You had to be reprimanded until you made a better print, or made good prints, or till you realized what a good print was too. So there was always that aspect of teaching, both in the group, but both also formally with many of the group members too. So.
What about philosophical
Mm-hmm.
A lot going on. There seems to be a shift from the 60s moment to the 70s moment as far as what the role of the group, but really more the role of the photographs were.
Mm-hmm. I'm not quite sure, and I can't speak for what the history of the Kamoinge is in terms of philosophy, because in the early days I wasn't there. I joined at around 70. So, but in the early days there was no separation from a social documentary and from craft. And there might have been a shift away where people thought about, I've done that, and then there's, I'm a fine art photographer. But in the early days, there was no separation. You could be a social documentarian and an artist also. You could be. That's true of Bresson. That's true of Lewis Hines. That's true of August Saunders. It's true of, you can name all the great names who did both. So that's not a problem too. I think there was also, but there was always this aspiration, again, using music as the model to make what you did art. So no matter what you did, it had to be fine art, and it was fine art in the sense that it was the thing taken to its highest level. I remember once because I was curating at the Studio Museum, a friend wanted to take me and introduce me to a friend of his in Philadelphia. And this was a brilliant artist guy, Charles Searles, who's, I don't know if you know Charles, but Charles died a few years ago. But I went down to look at work, and the work was brilliant. And then I went upstairs, and I was in the bathroom, and I looked at the way the pipes came out of the wall, and they came out of the wall, went beautifully down the wall, colored beautiful angle. And I went back downstairs and said, Charles, who the hell did that plumbing? And he said, oh, there's a German plumber down the street. I said, Charles, that's the best art in the house. And I said, why did I say that? He was highly offended. Yeah, I'm visiting an artist, the New York curator is coming down to visit you, and you're joking about the best art in the house is the plumbing? So, but I was, ultimately there was a truth in that. Ultimately, not that the best art in the house was plumbing, is that anything can be made fine art. Anything taken to its highest level is fine art. And I think that's what we were trying to do in Kamoinge. No matter what your subject matter, no matter how you try to approach the subject, you were trying to make it fine art. The same way, John Coltrane, why would John Coltrane practice 13 hours a day? This is the man, nobody plays the saxophone better than him. What's he practicing for? What's he aspiring to? Because the quest at that time switches from being technical to being spiritual. The quest is deeper than, I just want to work at my craft. There's something you're pursuing that's deeper, so. And I think that's also true of Kamoinge members. And maybe that's why we were so influenced by music, particularly by Train and Miles. They were always pursuing music to its highest level, and we were always pursuing our art to its highest level too. And they were inspirational for that reason.
So your work as a curator, you went back and did the show about Bravo, Vanity, among others. And one of the things I noticed that was not unique to the Black Photographers Annual, but I think was more what was happening in the era. Something that I'm assuming Deborah Willis was very influenced by in the early 70s, was the need to reconstruct the histories of previous African American photographers and make that history available. Is that something that you talked about in Kamoinge, or just something that was more a wider spread?
I think it's wider, yeah. I think when we talk about the fact that people out of Kamoinge and people, photographers from a certain time, actually made a attempt to document and to do kind of historical observations of our own work and our progress, like the Black Photographers Annual, which was actually generated by a lot of people who came out of Kamoinge. I think that's not a thing specific to Kamoinge. And also, it's funny, when we first started the Black Arts, we were talking about we're going to bring art to Harlem. And we bumped into Kwame Brathwaite and Ilambe Brath, his brother. And they said, the Black Art started in 1965. We said, we've been doing this since 1954. So it was just our arrogance to act like we're bringing something to Harlem that wasn't already there. It was just stupid, in fact. And it was only someone from outside could say something dumb like that, So, but what it did was also make us realize that we are at a particular point in a flow. If you look at history as these kind of specific incidents, that's problematic. If you look at it as a flow, as a current, as a river, then you understand where you're positioning it and how you you are just manifestation of the same thing that was going on before. So the Black arts was just part of the Harlem Renaissance, continuation of the Harlem Renaissance. The understanding of our particular needs is coming out of Garvey's movement, which is the Harlem Renaissance too, the UNIA. So we inherited that too, and we act just as the same group that I talked about, Ilambe and Kwame, they came out of Garvey's movement. They came out of Carlos Cooks, who was Garvey's lieutenant. So their very attempts to understand culture and to continue it, and their fusion of art and jazz at the same time was part of us in the same historical trajectory. We didn't invent it; we were part of it, and we just observed it as a valid part of the culture. So we didn't begin it, but we also understood this importance. So when you come out with the Black Photographers Annual, or the way Tony was really good at that, of documenting a certain amount of historicity, so that he would do these historical pictures. He remembered the famous picture of all the jazz musicians on 126th Street. And in fact, I have one of my closest friends was one of the little kids in the photograph. I didn't know that till much later, because he lived on that same block, and he just came out when they started taking the pictures and sat around when they took the picture too. But then he told me later on he was one of the little kids sitting in the photograph. Well, Tony did a whole series based on that too. But that's also continuing the ideas that, okay, that did the kind of standard older jazz musicians, all the new thing musicians, nobody was doing that with. Tony took them on a rooftop and did a huge portrait of all these musicians. I don't know, maybe 100 musicians on the rooftop. But just a beautiful idea. But Tony also had a lot of thoughts about that. This is Tony Barbosa. Had a lot of thoughts about that. So he would always document the work that we were doing, that Kamoinge was doing. And he'd put together a beautiful little booklet of each Kamoinge member with a portrait, and then a example of their work too. So a really nice work with it. But there's that sense of history and our place in history and the need to document it, us as history, is a continuation. It's a continuation of, first of all, it's a continuation of recognizing the general lack in the United States and in the culture of the United States, and in the African diaspora, that we need to deal with that tradition, that we need to document ourselves, we need to talk about how relevant we are, and that we need to leave that record for people after us too. So.
That's a good point to ask you. I know that you joined, several years after the naming of the group.
Mm-hmm.
Given that you were friends with Amir Baraka, and thinking about African culture and a shift in the mid-60s to thinking more about African culture versus focusing just on Western culture, what did the name Kamoinge mean for you and in your understanding of the group you joined?
No, it's funny. And just speaking personally about myself, my particular interest in Africa and things Black actually was started in high school too, because it started at home. It started with the family too, and particularly with my mother, who always validated right and wrong. So she always made a point about that too. My father was really much into the first Black person do this, first Black do, and I couldn't give a damn because I didn't identify with the United States. So I didn't see that as a valid culture in the first place. I saw it as a place fraught with a negative history and a kind of a living lie is how I saw it too. So, and then that's also why I identified with Mary's work when I came across it. But he was Leroy Jones at the time writing. But my really introduction to that came with James Baldwin. With reading James Baldwin while I was in high school, and it was Nobody Knows My Name, and but the whole slew of things. What's the book he did on Notes of a Native Son too? Those type of things. But there's just understanding and sharing that consciousness, and realizing, there are other people who think like that, except they write better than I do, and they can think better than I do. But it's just glad to know the material was there. And I always saw that it was Amiri's work. But also Amiri had the other part that they were missing, and this came out of course, Amiri's working in Harlem. So, and being very much influenced by Ilambe and Kwame Brathwaite, because their whole validation of Africa, and that's what they got that from Garvey, but Amiri got that from the Times and from realizing that Africa had been demonized in Western culture, and then to look at it and to realize that you've been tricked, you've been lied to about African culture. That Africa is a home of cultures, home of the things we call jazz, the kind of social structures that we talk about, right down to insurance companies in the United States, is all influenced by African culture. That American culture is tripartite. It's European, it's Native American, and it's African. And just identifying the African elements too. And Mary was very good at identifying the African elements. And that's what I teach. I teach about African culture in the Americas too. So I, of course, would identify with that. And when the word, something like using a Gikuyu word for the name, I love that. I love the fact that, we have models within African culture of things we want to do. And it's funny hearing some of the other members of Kamoinge talk. I realized that the whole idea of Kamoinge means working together, basically working together. And I realized that's roughly what we still do. 50-something years later, we still just work together. That is the point of the group, of working together, and with the thrust of newer members like Russell Fredericks, who loves getting active and putting up exhibits, that we still work together. And we try to make that a part of what we do, And with all the kind of arguments and the kind of disruptive times, but it's still ultimately working together. We're still doing that too. So, and working together using an African-based model, which is, I think, still fulfilling for us.
Is it a good time to ask? I'll circle back to some more specific things, but something we ask everybody is beyond what the word means to you. What did Kamoinge itself
Right.
mean to you?
When I think about it, and ultimately, what does Kamoinge mean? What does it mean to me? It means excellence. Even in our moments of weakness, it means excellence. It means trying to take our artistic level to the highest form that we can. And we have members who are doing that. Lou Draper was a great model of it. In fact, I could just run through the whole litany of people who were like Lou was one, Al Fanar, Buford Smith, Herbie Randall, who's brilliant photographer, Adja Collins. All of them, when you think about the excellent, and the newer members too, like Radcliffe Roy and Jules Allen and Delphine Diallo, Delphine Fawundu, incredible artists too. Layla is all. These are all. Their intention is that. Their intention is excellence. And that's one of the things I still think about Kamoinge. In fact, we have been described by other photographers, she will not be named, who are just grumpy old men. Can't say that anymore because now it'd be grumpy young women. but on one level she's right. On one level, the Kamoinge was known as kind of elitist in the sense that we were always geared toward excellence. And not everybody was invited in. Because if we presumed that you weren't focused on the same thing and weren't pursuing the same kind of trajectory, we weren't interested either, But I think it's still that. I think it's still about excellence, And it's a standard set by Lou Draper. Lou is really a funny person too, because Lou and I were very close. But Lou is really interesting because, I would just come to a meetings and there would be long lapses in my economic world, and I'd shake hands with Lou. And I realized he just slipped me a $20 bill. I never asked him for any money. I never asked for that. But he just looked at me and said, I guess he's hungry or something. But he just gave me money. I remember once too, I was going somewhere. I lent Lou my cameras. I lent him 2 Nikon Photomics. And Lou had unique ways of doing things. So Lou decided he would hide them by sticking them in the oven. Yeah, and then he forgot and he cooked them. But it was good because he cooked, and then he paid me for them so I could buy new cameras, and that's when I switched. These were Nikons, that's when I switched to Canon. I thought it must be a sign that I'm supposed to change to another company too. So I switched from Nikons to Canons too. But it was really funny. I thought only Lou would stick them in the oven and then burn them, and cook them, so. It was nice though. Mm-hmm.
He was involved in International Black Photographers.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about how that grew out of Kamoinge? Were you a member of that?
But I can't remember this thing, but I think it's basically Buford. Buford and blanking on the other names too. Joe.
That was the annual. The International Black Photographers.
Right. Oh, right.
But the International Black Photographers
Yeah, but I was also basically Kamoinge members too. The heads of it all Kamoinge members too, you
It
know.
was
So
and
yeah,
Kenny and Sean
and Tony,
and Tony.
yeah.
And then,
And they used to have the meetings at the Studio Museum when I was working there, you know. So
so you were part of it. There were the meetings there.
well, no, I was part of it, but I didn't plan the meetings. I was just teaching at the Studio Museum. And I was teaching filmmaking there at the time, but also I was curating. The director at the time doesn't remember that I was also curating. He said, "No, you just taught filmmaking." I said, "No," but and I showed him the things I did for the films that I mean for the shows that I did while I was there, and he didn't remember that I had done those. You know, so. No, but the International Black Photographers, I think Kamoinge is philosophically more influential than just our members, because the members also have done a lot of different things, like the Black Photographers Annual, but also the International Black Photographers is an outgrowth of all that too. But they're also because there was such a need. There are all these people in photography, and one of the things about photography, particularly now with digital, is that it's accessible, and because there's immediate learning curve, it's something that you can learn. And like you can't learn to oil paint unless you have a really a studio and a place to work and someone to teach you how to apply paint. But with photography, you can always look at the print. You always see what you got. You know, it's immediate feed. And digital is immediate. It's not, the other ones you could, take a day when you process the film and then you come back and you say, oh man, my exposures are all wrong. But digital is immediate. So you can have access to acquiring the craft real easily. And I think that's, one of the things. So there's this ready body of people who want to express that too. And International Black Photographers was part of that. But part of what they did was organized to celebrate older photographers. And they organized to celebrate James Vanderzee. Actually, when I went back to the Studio Museum, I was the James Vanderzee curator of photography, film, and video. And I had to take all of Vanderzee's stuff and look at the work. What was funny about that is because Vanderzee had 59,000 photographs at the time that I had to go through. And interspersed with all the other works were nitrate negatives. And nitrate negatives can spontaneously combust. So I had to take them out and take them to Rochester so they could be put in a vault so they wouldn't blow up and burn the whole collection away. So, but they celebrated Vanderzee, they celebrated Roy, they celebrated Gordon Parks, all not at the same time, of course, but they celebrated all the elder photographers too. It was a beautiful thing to do, incredible.
Yeah, it's interesting. So we have documents of all of these, but there's an interview. So Lou interviewed Morgan and Marvin Smith, and it looks like it was going to be for a 5th volume of the annual that
Never came out?
So I didn't know if that, and by that time, which was the early 80s, you were at the Studio Museum. I didn't know if you had any connection to that.
No, but I wasn't there then. And I don't think they met at the Studio Museum at that time too. That was because the Studio Museum moved to a newer location too. Yeah. But actually, I worked in a film with Morgan and Marvin Smith. It wasn't my film, but the film was shot by Bobby Shepard, who was a photographer and one of the top cameramen in the country too.
About film, so you went to film school. Jimmy obviously shot film. Lou went to film school. Can you talk at all about the larger, if there's anybody else who was working on film, but two, did Lou, he was also writing plays and then screenplays.
Mm-hmm.
Was there a career trajectory there that he thought he was going to work towards?
I don't know, it's interesting about our backgrounds because Lou and myself and a few other people were also filmmakers. We went to film school, of course, but there were a whole slew of people doing the same thing. There was Jim Hinton, there's Doug Harris, there's Jack Harris, known as Patah now, but they all were filmmakers. There's a whole body, and they all came out of WNET's Black Filmmaking Workshop, which was, there was still many of them are still around too. And actually in this neighborhood on 42nd Street, many of them lived right here because they lived in Manhattan Plaza across the street, which is one of the housing communities for artists. But everybody was making films too. It was part of the mission. The same way we were documenting with still photography, African American culture, we were doing it with film too. With film, and then now it's all video too.
But Lou didn't go on to make a film that we know of.
That's what I know of. So.
Yeah. What were you guys filming in film school? What were the kinds of things?
No, in film school, this is NYU's Graduate Institute of Film and Television. We had to learn all aspects of filmmaking. So we had to write our scripts, choose our actors, and do a production, make films just for that. In fact, Spike Lee went to the same school right like a few years right after we did, you know. So, and I met Spike in the halls just because I used to come back to repair my equipment, my movie equipment, you know. But everybody had to do that. And I think the ones who least benefited from that were Lou and myself, you know, because we didn't turn out films when everybody else did. And that was actually my advice to Spike. He said, don't look at this as a school project. Look at this as an opportunity to make the film you want and make the film you want. Don't make a student project because that puts a ceiling on it. Just make the film that you want to do. That's when he did. She got to have it, you know. So do not make it well, I have to do this to get a grade. Make it, I have a crew, I have a budget, I have equipment. Make the film I want to make. Take it as though you're someone that's actually producing it and paying for it, you know. You're producing, but you might make a film so it's a film you can use when you get out of here.
You brought up Lizette Modell, and the only other person who's brought up Lizette Modell has been me. And I forgot to ask her about it on the film. So Lizette Modell was teaching at the school.
New School for Social Research, right.
So what was influential about her? Was it her work itself, or was it a certain way she was teaching?
Well, both. Well, in terms of my photographic education, one of the most influential people was Lizette Modell. And I didn't realize it until much later that she was a kind of institution in the world. She had taught Diane Arbus and quite a few other people who had gone through the New School. But what I got from her too is because it wasn't necessarily her craft, although later on I really liked her photography. But it wasn't like the way you'd look at her, say, at Edward Weston print. You know, it's certainly different. But what she did was pursue a kind of psychological statement. And that's what she opened Diane Arbus to doing too. But that's valid. You know, okay, this might seem a little quirky. And there are people who've done that along. Saunders somehow did that too, depending on who he shot, but she made it valid. Not made it valid, but she said, no, this is a valid way to see. You can look at people and they might be strange, and that might be the point. And it's not, you're not being an opportunist, you're not using them, you're not embarrassing them, you're just looking at them straight. And a lot of people are afraid to do that, you know, so there's a kind of veil thing, you know, it's abusive to look at somebody who's deformed or crippled. She said, no, it's not. It's just looking, it's being honest. You know, so she freed a lot of people psychologically in terms of the work, the way they approach work too. You know? And I mean, I think it's a much more subtle kind of influence in terms of the work when you look at the history of photography too. But it's still there. It's this is not a clinical study. This is, some photography of a valid subject.
Yeah, I think it's important to recover her influence in a broader.
Right.
Diane Arbus always gets points. So Lizette Modell and Diane Arbus, but the wider circle of artists that she
Right.
influenced through teaching was really.
But she was really helpful because, I don't know, I got to like her and she liked me, so she used to invite me by her house. She used to live in 7th Avenue South, and I'd just go to her house and visit her and say hello, But it was just also, I was just charmed that she thought I was interesting enough to invite to the house, so. But I also liked her work, and I was, I didn't realize how influential she was until later, too. Same with Paul Caponegro. I didn't realize, that's Paul Caponegro? That's the guy who prints too damn dark and is always, talking about piano music. And oh, okay. Oh, he's Paul Caponegro. Oh, okay. Then you realize, oh, he's an important figure in the world of photography. Yeah.
Aaron Siskind never around. I guess he done the.
He wasn't in the city, no. No. But it's funny though, because even though I specifically studied with a lot of great teachers, but also one of the things that's great about photography is that you can always study with everybody, as long as they made a book. If they didn't make a book, because you can study with Siskind, you can study with everybody if they're nowhere around. One of my favorite photographers was Cortez. You know, I didn't know he lived down the street, though. He used to live around the corner from NYU. He lived right across from Washington Square Park. A lot of his famous photographs are from his terrace looking down into the park, too. But that was one of my favorite photographers, too. So if I had known he was there, I'd have gone and rung his doorbell and said hello.
Yeah, Tony and Ming went to see him because they've got photographs of Cortez and Ming in Cortez's studio.
Uh-huh.
And then, I'm trying to think who else comes up. Imaging Cunningham, although they went out in December. Do you remember kind of how it seems like there's different versions, but it seems like Kamoinge went pretty quiet from maybe 83 or so until it came back in 1991.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, was it just not meeting, or and you would see
No, I think they were always meeting. I wasn't going to meetings, but they were always meeting, though. And I don't know how many people were there, but I think Sean talks about that they were always, actually Kamoinge was always meeting, you know, so there might have been short lapses, you know, like we're not going to meet until late August again, you know, but that's just 2 months now. But no, Kamoinge always met, which is funny for me because I guess if you're out of the loop, you don't know it, you know, like Jimmy was joking about that too, you know, so. But no, they always met. And I think there have been kind of this kind of zeniths and nadirs, you know. And that's not strange at all. It's just, you know, part of a group that stays together for 50 years, you know. So.
And I think the moment you were in seems like it was, they were very active in 63 to 65,
Mm-hmm.
and then it was a little bit less active, especially, they were doing more with youth programs. But then it seems like about when you and Maine joined is when the Studio Museum exhibition happened and the ICP show happened.
Mm-hmm.
In quick succession, and then Buford was working on the Black Photographers Annual, and then International. So it seems like there were sort of distinct phases of productivity.
Right. I don't know if Kamoinge can be broken into phases of productivity or lapses. I think they're always going on being productive, but at different levels. You know, so I mean, there was always something happening, at least individually too. And you look around too, like we have a new member, Jules Allen. Who I don't know if people know Jules' work, but Jules has 5 books out, and they're all self-published, which I did not know. You know, but they're beautifully, beautifully done. And so there are people who work no matter what. You know, I mean, people used to joke with me about that, saying, well, when am I going to see your work? You got 20 cameras, when are you going to see some work? They don't realize I always work, that I always have work. You know, you don't want to see the few thousand things that I did because they're all not worth seeing, but, you know, always working. I think that most of the members of the group are like that too. They're always doing something.
Well, what have we not covered that we said we were going to? We talked about jazz.
What do you think the legacy of
Grumpy old men and women, now grumpy old men and grumpy young women. No. But no, I think the legacy of Kamoinge is, as I've mentioned before, is about excellence. But when you see the kind of cumulative impact, and when you see the collective body of work of most of the members, you're talking about people who had a certain artistic integrity and a kind of a quality to their work that is consistent. And that, I mean, again, I have to make these analogies with music. You know, when you do like a discography of Miles Davis, a discography of Duke Ellington, you get a sense of who they are. And I think when you start seeing the portfolios of Kamoinge members and the books of all the members too, because all the members are always shooting. Some of them, like Frank Stewart, who's the senior photographer for Jazz at Lincoln Center, appropriately Jazz at Lincoln Center, where he would do thousands of photographs every concert. You know, what does that body of work look like at the end? And half of the work is art, is fine art. It's not just documentation of the Jazz at Lincoln Center, it's his interpretation of that and made into fine art too. So one of our best exhibits, I work with the curatorial team of Robert O'Mealy, who's at Columbia, also Deirdre Harris Kelly, who's also at Columbia. Deirdre's head of the Romeo Bearden Foundation, and O'Mealy is the Zora Hurston Chair of Literature at Columbia. And our curatorial team sometimes includes Linda Florio, who is one of the top publishers, one of the top designers of books. But we did maybe 8 different shows for Jazz at Lincoln Center. We used to do them before they so unceremoniously fired us. They didn't even fire us, they just let us go. We couldn't even have a glorious moment of being fired. We were just let go. But we did some of the best works we've ever done. We're doing shows. We did shows on Herman Leonard, one of the deans of jazz photography, on Chuck Stewart, another who comes out of Herman Leonard. Both of them went to Ohio University, same place Adger went. And then when all of us were learning photography too with Chuck Stewart, we were learning on 44th Street in the studio that he got from Herman Leonard. So you have this direct connection between this jazz lineage and these jazz photographers and a whole slew of black photographers and filmmakers in New York City too. But one of the shows we did was a Frank Stewart show. But it just talked about Frank and his life, his multiple lives, as a jazz photographer, as a person from the black community, as a photographer who worked in Cuba, as a photographer who worked in Africa, which is like a summation of the aspirations of the people in Kamoinge. But it's also, again, tied around the world of music, the world of jazz too. So that's some of the most fulfilling things, is just curating things like that. So when Bob and Deirdre and myself were doing these exhibits, we were really happy just to do that. But it's really funny how you think. Because one day we were asked to do a show at Nathan Cummings Foundation, and we were looking for themes to do. And I just started talking to Bob about Kamoinge and Enfoco. And so he said, a group of basically Latino photographers, and Bob said, why don't you do an exhibit in Kamoinge and Enfoco? So it was too close to home for me to even recognize that we should do that. Yeah, right. And that's exactly what we did. But it was I think another great show that we did for that too. But again, a photographic show with Enfoco having a kind of similar aspiration to Kamoinge. So we've done a lot of partnering with them too recently.
Yeah, Bob came down to the museum.
Mm-hmm. You ever hear Bob lecture?
Talking about what we were talking about Romeo Bearden. And did they tell you it was Angela Davis was giving a talk? So he came, and then we got to give her a tour of the Black Photographers annual exhibition. But she talked until 11 o'clock at night, and that whole part of the museum was the lights were controlled by computers, so we couldn't turn it back on.
Oh,
so
shit.
the security guard
Uh-huh.
showed Angela Davis the exhibition with the big flashlight. It was Bob.
I love it.
Angela Davis and me, and we're walking through.
But Bob is scary brilliant too. We're just talking, just when he lectures. He's one of the few, like Debbie does 8 million black portraiture things a year, and Bob goes to all of them. And he's the one everybody remembers because Bob actually practices his talks. He actually writes them. He actually does research. I said, Bobby, what's wrong with you? What? You're going to talk for 15 minutes? Just get up there and ad-lib like you can do, He won't. He refuses. He does new research, writes it down, thinks about it, and then crafts his talk to the 10 minutes. So it fits into the 10 minutes. I just talked to him about that. This is yesterday. And he said, well, some people, they spoke for 40 minutes. I said, like you should have done. Like, instead of wasting your time and cutting it all, actually being on time too, so.
So, how much time do we have? Oh, okay, plenty of time. Okay, thinking also about, because of what you teach, African culture through the diaspora, several of the photographers went back to various countries in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Tony DeSemple, naming Tony DeSemple, and Lou DeSemple, Sean to various countries.
Mm-hmm.
How much dialogue was there? And they were doing that in the 70s. How much dialogue was there about that in Kamoinge?
Well, it's actually funny because I'm working on an exhibit now with 3 Kamoinge members, John Pinder Hughes, Frank Stewart, and Adger Collins. It was called Head, Heart, and Heritage. 3 African Americans look for a place called home. That's the rough title. That's not going to be whatever the title is, because they said it's too long, it's too wordy now. But what it's recognized, it was basically put together by Pinder Hughes and by Adger and Frank, who've been working on it for over a decade. But it's reflecting on their time in the 70s when they all were looking for heritage. This is Adger going to Suriname and to Brazil, Frank going to Cuba, but also to Africa, and Pinder Hughes going to Africa starting in the 60s too. But all photographing that same kind of quest, But it's a continuation of that same struggle for identity that we find in the United States with the Black Photographers Annual, with all the photographers, but it's that internationally, and it's that with a nod towards someplace other than here as being home, a place that nurtures you. So that's been a kind of common theme in a lot of the work of the people in Kamoinge too. Sean has all this early work from Cuba. Everybody has early work from somewhere else, which is really interesting too. I have work from this foreign country called Newark, New Jersey. So there's a lot of this early work that comes out of Newark, But there is always that quest too.
Did you have that similar quest?
Yeah.
So tell me.
But my quest in terms of that was Brazil most of the time, because I've been to Brazil 39 times, and I speak Portuguese, and I went there. In fact, everybody went there because of Black Orpheus. When everybody saw the film Black Orpheus, said, "We got black people in Brazil. Oh shit, let me go there. That's where I want to go." But then I went there, and I felt like I was going home too. I met all these people who looked exactly like they did, had the same body language. They were just speaking Portuguese, Which I said, if I had known this, I wouldn't have wasted my time with French in college. I would have studied another language that I would have wanted to learn, so I had a reason to learn it. I didn't feel like going to Paris. But I do feel like going to Brazil. I like talking to people in Brazil too. So, but I've done a lot of work there. In fact, I was in an exhibit at the Schomburg, and it was I think Jean Matusimi and I were in it. Jean Matusimi Ash. We were both photographers in the show. And so we were talking. I had just come back from Brazil, and I was talking to her about Brazil. And so she said, "You should talk to Arthur being her husband, Arthur Ashe. He just came back from Brazil too." And so, but they were upstairs at the Schomburg, and they were doing an anti-apartheid meeting to try and mobilize against South African apartheid. And so he came down. We talked for about a half an hour. I was just telling him how excited I was about going to Brazil. And I'd actually gone because there was a conference put together by the Caribbean Culture Center by Marta Vega, who's one of the real movers and players in the arts world and the culture world in New York City. And it was a conference on African religious traditions, and done in Brazil. She did the first one in '81 in Nigeria, in Lagos, Nigeria, honoring again the African traditions that people were recognizing here. And then the second one was supposed to be next year in Brazil, but it turned out to be in '83. And so we went for that. And it was really funny because of the nature of the conference, it gave me entree to all these religious traditions. So when I would go to these tejeros, I wouldn't be seen as an outsider. I was being seen as someone from a similar form coming from the United States. So it was an incredible entree. So when I just talked to Arthur about all that, we just had an incredible discussion. And he talked about how much he enjoyed his visit there. And then 2 days later, I get a call from Jeannie and said, "Look, if you want to go to Brazil and photograph, Arthur will pay for it. He just wants you to give him a budget." Now this is got to be February 83, 84. And so he can't write off his taxes, he can't do it. It's just a gift to go photograph in Brazil. So I gave him a budget, and then it's really funny because I was curating at the Studio Museum. And I had grown tired of curating there, and we were sitting in a meeting, and Mary Campbell said, "Well, Danny, you're gonna have to do this, this, and this." And I said, "I think you're going to have to find somebody else to do that because I'm not going to be here much longer." And then I said, "Oh shit, did I just resign?" I'm listening to myself resign. It wasn't intentional, but I guess it was necessary. Then I walked out in the hallway and someone said, "What happened to you? You look like a weight was lifted off your shoulders." I said, "Yeah, I just resigned." I said, "Oh, it was time to go, I guess, But it was really funny. And it was only because Arthur had given me the grant, And I just sat in the meeting and I said, "Oops, let me say what I really feel." "No, you got to find somebody. I'm not going to be here much longer." And then I was gone, so. Well, that was good. It was a good thing,
Kind of fascinating that both Lee and Arthur Ashe grew up in Richmond, Virginia. Just one of those full circle.
It's funny because what's the name? Bob's ex-wife, who's a close friend of mine. I don't know if you know her work. Jackie Malone. She's a dance historian. She did a book called Stepping on the Blues, The Visible Rhythms of African American Dance. Did another one called Class Act about Charlie Atkins and Honey Coles. And then her third book, she's working on right now, is on the Chorus Line. But she grew up in Virginia also. She grew up in Richmond. She's from Richmond also. And she played tennis also.
Wow. Yeah. Did Lou ever talk about Richmond?
Have I heard her?
Did Lou ever talk about Richmond?
He did. I just can't remember what he was saying, yeah. No, but I love talking to Lou because Lou he was the absent-minded professor too, you know. And we used to have jokes about Lou. Oh, I got barbecue sauce in that lens. Let me smear it on so it's smooth. And then it didn't matter. The prints were spectacular, you know. So.
I'm still so fascinated with your connection with the Mary Baraka, just because I think also, I think some numbers will.
You've seen my picture of them. I have a nice photo of
Yeah,
them.
I love that photograph.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any prints of it, but we're gonna talk about that here. We'll get there. But some members will seem more political than others, and some I think have forgotten that they were political.
Well, but I heard Jimmy say that Lou wasn't political. That's bullshit. Lou was definitely political.
Yeah.
But he was never not artistic. No, Lou was always, if his politics also had to be manifest artistically. You see that when he has a guy pushing a cart in the street, that's just as political as you could possibly get. The sense of integrity in the person's face and the strength in them, that's all political too. You can't separate them because it's not, walking down the street with a placard or a sign saying, give us a job or something, that doesn't stop it from being political, To celebrate your culture is also a political act, in a country that demeans your culture every day. You know what I mean? So what do you call political? So it doesn't have to be like the standard politics. So I use the term United Statesian. I like to say Americans too. When I was working on Jimmy's film in Guyana, guy looked at me and said, "Oh, where are you from?" I said, "I'm from America." He said, "Yeah, me too." "Now, where are you from?" "Oh," I said, "I'm from the United States in North America." He said, "I'm from Guyana in South America." No, because you grow up in this imperialism and you carry it with you. You might think you're politically correct and you might just be another imperialist from the United States, So I had to thank him for reminding me that we're all part of that too. Good luck with this project too.
Yeah.
We all really like what you're trying to do.
I'm trying to, it's really about Lou and about Kamoinge, because I really see them as inseparable, and for me, the historical culture.
I think in a funny sense, Roy was symbolic. Just the very fact that Roy wasn't necessarily a member of Kamoinge. He was asked to come in and to work with them out of respect for them. But the real philosophical intention of Kamoinge was Lou Draper. I mean, there are other people who were reinforced his kind of aspirations for high artistic levels, Ray Francis and Al Fanar and Andrew Collins, all Buford Smith, all the early members that's what they were about. But the whole thing that held it together, the glue that held it together was Lou Draper. The glue, and the kind of mentoring that Lou always did. The fact that Lou would never talk badly to a student, although some of the people could be rough with each other. When someone came in trying to learn, Lou was the most gracious teacher there was. So that's why everybody still remembers Lou as a teacher, as their teacher too. He's not trying to beat you up. He's trying to understand how you can fulfill yourself as an artist. And that's what the group tried to do too. And he tried to beat you up, but.
Beautiful. That's fantastic. I think. Are there any other specific things about your own work that you remember developing from joining Kamoinge? Were there any shifts in subject matter, or was it just craft? Was there a dialogue?
Well, I was already self-motivated in terms of African culture, about African people, and about social justice too. But there was a continual idea that you had to keep your level high. And that's coming from Lou, from Al Fanar, from Adger, and from aspiring to Roy, but also as every other photographer you ever saw who meant something to you, and every musician who you ever heard who meant something to you too. So, the musicians I loved the most too were phenomenal craftsmen too. Someone like Mingus, Charles Mingus, who was one of the greatest bass players ever, and John Coltrane. Now how do these people who are masters of their instrument practice all day long? And that's something to be learned from them. Train doesn't need to practice. Mingus doesn't need to practice. but you hear that they do. When they play, you hear the fact that they practice all the time too. So I think a lot of Kamoinge is like that too. And if you have a chance to see some of Alfanar's work too, I don't know. There's so many beautiful, beautiful pieces by Alfanar too.
I'm trying. I wanted to give his daughter the time I contacted her, but I'm
Yep.
hoping that there are some prints that are left. I mean, everything I've seen has been in the annual or reproduced in something. I haven't
Right.
seen the prints themselves.
I can't remember what happened to the stuff we did a show together too. I wasn't in the show. I curated the show.
Yeah.
This was for Linda Bryant when she had a gallery called Just Above Midtown, and it was Pinder Hughes, Adger, and Alfanar. But beautiful, beautiful prints. But also he was very much influenced by kind of like a meditative, contemplative, approach, but very much by Japanese photography too, and Japanese art too. So it's so funny. Herb, have you talked to Herb Randall?
Yes, we went out to Herb Randall.
You interviewed him too?
Yeah, he's Herb. He was,
How did you do that?
he has some wonderful quotes. He would say,
He is funny. He looked at my body of my work one time and said, I can't look at any more of this. I want to throw up if I keep. But because what I do is really rarefied. If you read the language, it's too much of that same diet. So I have to look, okay, I've seen 10 of them, shit, it's the same thing over and over again. You just might have different composition, but it's the same, you're saying the same statement all the time. I can't really look at any more of this. I'll throw up if I see any more. So you're right, that's how I feel about it.
What
So.
was the statement that you kept repeating in your work?
Who?
the statement, you.
Well, I don't know. But I know it's a compositional thing, and I know it's like most artists only make one statement, and they just do it over and over again, So, and I know that I do it over and over again. I can tell when I see it, So I guess it's my vocabulary too.
So how would you describe visually your vocabulary?
Well, I'm direct and sparse. In terms of my photography, I try to be very direct, very sparse. I don't like artifice. I don't like too much jangling around, unless the jangling around is the point, So, but you look at it and you realize, damn, this is the same statement over and over again. It might be slightly different, and I don't mind that either, as long as it's true to what I want to say, But it's a one trick pony or something, So I don't know.
I'm trying to think of the photographs I've seen of yours that they don't seem. I mean, yeah. We could talk about Journey of the Rock photograph. I think it's so beautiful with the typewriter piece of paper. It makes that beautiful line with his face over it. Do you want to describe anything about making?
I can't even remember where I did it. So funny. That date might even be wrong. It might be earlier. It's 1970 in the date, so I don't know. I have to find the negative and see where it was done. Because I had thought that was done in Harlem on the Black Arts, but it probably wasn't. I think he had moved back to Newark by then too, so I'm not sure. So, yeah.
That also brings the one more thing with Lou, because Lou also wrote. So it's before you joined the group, but for the first and second portfolio, he wrote the statement for the first portfolio. We wrote a poem for the second one, and that poem got reproduced in Camera magazine. But Langston Hughes, James Baldwin, Amir Baraka, there are so many literary figures that are also around it, and it seems more than just cultural context. I think my sense is that the members were reading this work very seriously.
I'm sure they were. Yeah. But Lou was really thoughtful too, and he wouldn't blurt out some kind of silliness. He would think about it, and people would consider what he said. So there was a lot of that, and some of that comes from Roy too. With Roy as one of the models. Roy wasn't a person of many words, but he was really clear, and he was also Roy could be irate about things. He could be offended by these kind of lapses in integrity, or lapses in craft, or lapses, that too. So it's really funny when we did The Sound I Saw, the jazz photographs of Roy DeCarava. He did another book called The Sound I Saw, but it was just his regular photographs. And we did it, we used Eastern Press, and they were one of the first in the United States to do duotones a certain way. And I thought they were slightly muddy, but Roy loved that. And then when Friends of Photography did The Sound I Saw, they did it all with laser printing, incredibly beautiful, crisp prints. Roy hated it. He thought our prints were better because he wanted that muddy kind of blur. Not as muddy is already like a value judgment. It's not. He wanted a less contrasty connection between the grays. Because to him, there's no whites and there's no blacks. It's all grays. It's all different grays too. So I guess that's a personal choice, but a personal choice I think was overpowering the work at times too. So.
The Sweet Flat Paper of Life got republished about the time you were working with him on.
Right after that,
Yeah.
Yeah. But that was by his choice. You know what happened with Sweet Fly Paper of Life? Roy just was talking to Langston Hughes, and Langston asked him for some prints. Then he came back and found out there was a book in the making. He didn't have any input into the book. So this is the way he really wanted the book, because they cropped the photographs, they did a lot of things that he wouldn't have done. And then when he had an opportunity, that's why he redid the book. He would do the compositions the way he wanted them to. So
did he change some of the photographs between the first and the third edition? There's a second edition, and then the third edition is the 1980s one. I'll have to look at it.
well, I had a first edition and a second one, and I gave the first one away, not even thinking about it. So.
I'm in the mix of trying to get the first edition right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm not sure with Roy. I don't know what he really wanted in the first place. I'm sure if he knew, he would have told somebody. So it was funny working with Roy. In The Sound I Saw, the picture of the dancers.
Yes. Yeah.
He didn't want to show that first. I said, why not? He said, well, because it is. It reminds me of black people having to contort themselves to fit into the society. I said, yeah, but you give up an incredibly beautiful photograph because you have some kind of damn overlay of negative interpretation of it, and that's not, that's you. That has nothing to do with this photograph. That's you talking about us in this culture. But this photograph is not saying that. So I finally convinced him to publish it, but he didn't want to do it.
Yeah, it was in his retrospective, but I remember that he had a quote saying that he
I know.
saw a lot of ambivalence towards that photo.
I know, and I wrote about it because I felt the opposite to that, But what's really funny though is that like being your own worst enemy in that sense too, outthinking yourself and outguessing yourself, and de-interpreting yourself, so so you end up missing what you're doing in the first place too, even though you're doing it, So, well, we went through a few, like 300 and something photographs to put the show together, The Sound I Saw, and I decided, because there's a kind of strange indulgence that we have that also is problematic for musicians too. Like a musician like Train, or Indian musicians in particular, will practice for 6 or 7 hours a day. An audience can't listen for 6 or 7 hours. They're not trained that same way too. But the same way when we did the show, I made it into compartments. I don't know if Roy didn't like that or not, but I felt they had to have limited gestalts, and this is coming out of martial arts philosophy, that you can master 5 techniques. You can probably master 9, but to really be operative, you have to have 5. And I was just saying, if you put together a show with more than 5 categories, you've already lost your audience. And you're going to lose them, you're going to bore them, you're going to daze them, you're going to make them no longer to continue. And when Roy did the show at the Modern, Roy had the shows lined up as in chronology. It makes absolutely 300 something goddamn images that make no sense. An editor can go through half those images and still be with you, but a general audience, if there's no rationale for them, grouped together, you lose the audience, because they just don't have the tolerance for it. They don't have the kind of muscle memory or the kind of attention span to deal with it that way. So, but I wouldn't have never done that way. But I know Roy, that's how he wanted it done. But the chronology had nothing to do with them next to each other too. It's so funny, because I have a lot of philosophy about doing exhibits. One photograph is a statement or a syndrome, a series of statements. 2 photographs is a conversation. 3 or more photographs is a narrative. How do you direct the narrative? How do you make the conversation and direct the narrative? Now, when you just string them by chronology, there's no narrative. The narrative is chronology, which has nothing to do with why one image relates to another, and it doesn't relate to another. You know, it might be a totally different mindset, so it's good, but it bumps into the kind of practical limitation of human beings and your ability to concentrate in a rarefied situation, too. Like writing wall text has to be totally different than writing a book, because nobody can stand and read. I know you know, but all curators know that's something that you have to understand too. It has to be simple sentences. You can't show that you're a literary star. You know, that's not the point. The point is, how do you convey this information to someone who's standing reading in a situation that's not normal? You know, but that's the same with the way you put the works up on the wall. How do you put them up so people can read them, so people can have access to them? If you just string them together because you like that they were shot on different dates and you've already made a philosophical discussion that the chronology is important. When the chronology might not be important for the vision, you know. So, anyway,
That's great. Yeah. Unless there are any specific. Did you give his name? We did. What did we do?
You can just say your name and you're a photographer, maybe something about where you teach.
okay. Do you? You know, my name is Charles Daniel Dawson. I'm a photographer, a filmmaker, and a scholar on African culture. I teach at NYU in Gallatin School of Individualized Study, and I teach at Columbia in the Institute for Research in African American Studies. But my specialty is African culture in the Americas.
One other thing I wonder about is, I mean, you're talking about these great jazz masters, how, you know, their music becomes, they're not just practicing, it becomes kind of a spiritual experience.
Mhm.
Does photography feel like a spiritual?
Of course it is, yeah. But it's not just photography. Anything done to its highest level leads you in that. You know, and that thrust, this is what in Hinduism they call longing for Krishna. This is kind of this bittersweet or this melancholy leading you towards something to keep more fulfilling it to. But that's the same thing in photography. That's in anything, you know. And it's a spiritual quest, whether you're religious or have a very specific religious form. Everybody goes through that too. And that kind of longing that you have, why everything is not just right, it's more than just being a human means you have all these other aspirations too. How do you fulfill that too? Photography is one way of fulfilling it. Music is another way of fulfilling it. All the other art forms, but also doing anything you do to its excellence is a way of fulfilling that too. So.
I have one more question. So, one of the beautiful things Tony said about Kamoinge was that it taught him how to see. Since we're talking about the spiritual aspect of photography, not necessarily through Kamoinge, just thinking about your own photographs.
Mhm.
What was it that you think you set out to see when you photographed?
I've been always trying to figure out too, recently too, trying to figure out what I'm looking at, what I'm seeing too. And it's really funny because there's a vision already there. And I was talking to a friend who's a Congolese scholar. And I was just trying to find out, like in Buddhism, there's a thing in one form of Buddhism called everyday suchness, that there's a perfect moment, a perfect element of essence. You know, how do you feel? And I think I'm trying to photograph that too. But I was trying to photograph it in an African context too. What is the thing that makes it come all together and make it right? Not just graphically, but you know, what are the elements in the photograph that do that too? But it's a kind of contemplative thing too. And in fact, I have a series of photographs I did with that when I was working as a CETA artist. You know, and I was given a job. Unfortunately, all the photographers were asked to document somebody else's project. They never asked a poet to do anything other than write poetry. But the photographers, you have to go, well, take a picture of this for them. You know, but I was doing all Bronx historical sites, and I was trying to use that as a way of, for each role that I had to shoot for them at a historical site, I was trying to do my personal work on that too. And I came up with a portfolio called Portions and Proportions. But it was just a compositional studies. But what I was trying to do with that was another kind of Zen study too, and it might have been influenced by Lu and by Alfanar too, in terms of understanding everything has a placement, everything has a way it makes sense logically, the way. And then I find out later on that there's a Congo language like that. There are two writing systems in the Congo. One is called Bidimbu, and that's a graphic writing system, graphic structures. Actually a writing system. And then there's another one called Simsu. And the Simsu is where the way the river runs, the way the mountain range is in the background, the way the grass grows, that is a language. And how do you record that? How do you feel that? How do you make that come to life? How do you make that as a language? How do you make a photograph that says that this is a language and you can read it? So that's one of the things I was trying to do too. I think in one level, in that portion and proportion, I was successful in doing that too.
Thank you.
You're welcome.